Every settler in the Red Willow Valley knew where the new bridge would go. The county had announced it in October of 1883, nailed the notice right to the door of the land office in Harlan Creek, a proper engineered bridge to replace the old wooden crossing that had served the territory for 20 years. And every last one of them, ranchers, freight drivers, cattle bosses, was certain the bridge would be built at the southern crossing, where the main road already met the water. That crossing was wide and familiar. Wagon ruts ran 6 inches deep in the packed earth on either side. Stagecoaches used it 3 times a week. Cattle drives funneled through it every autumn. When the county auctioned the land parcels surrounding the southern crossing that November, men came from 2 counties over to bid. Stay with me, because the woman who saw what they all missed wasn't even in the room. Nora Prescott was 26 years old the autumn of the auction, and she had been alone on the land for nearly 3 years. Her husband, Thomas, had died in the spring of 1881. Typhoid, the same fever that had swept through half the homesteads along the creek that year. He was 31. They had been married 4 years. They had no children. What Thomas left her was a 120-acre claim on the east side of the valley, a half-finished cabin with a sod roof, and a bay mare named Juniper who had more sense than most men Nora had met. She also had a dog, a big, shaggy gray creature with amber eyes and a quiet disposition that people sometimes mistook for laziness. His name was Flint, and he had appeared at Nora's door 3 weeks after Thomas died, half-starved and limping from a coyote bite on his left hind leg. She fed him. He stayed. He never left her side after that, not once in all the years that followed. Before the valley, before Thomas, Nora had grown up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on a farm her grandfather had built with his own hands after emigrating from Bavaria in 1839. Her grandfather, Carl Meyer, had been a stonemason before he was a farmer. He could read rock the way other men read weather, knew limestone from sandstone by the sound it made when you struck it, knew which formations would hold weight and which would crumble in a generation. Nora had spent her childhood following him along creek beds and quarry walls, listening to him explain why certain bridges lasted centuries while others washed away in a single flood. "Clay is a liar," Carl told her once, standing on the bank of Pekea Creek when she was 9 years old. "It looks solid when it's dry, but water finds the truth in it. Water always finds the truth." She never forgot that. After Thomas died, most people expected Nora to sell the claim and go back east. A widow alone on a frontier homestead. The valley had seen it before. Women lasted a season, maybe 2, before the isolation and the labor broke them down. The Wheelers offered to buy her out at 60 cents on the dollar. The postmaster's wife, a well-meaning woman named Ruth Hadley, rode out twice in June to suggest that Nora could board the eastbound stage at Pine Bluff and be in Omaha within a week. "You've got people back in Pennsylvania," Ruth said. "There's no shame in going home." But Nora didn't sell, and she didn't go home. Home, as far as she was concerned, was the 120 acres Thomas had staked and the half-built cabin that still smelled like fresh-cut pine. She finished it herself, cutting and notching the logs through the summer of 1881, while Flint watched from the shade of a cottonwood tree, his amber eyes tracking every stroke of the axe. The work was brutal. She lost 15 pounds in July alone, and her hands blistered so badly that she had to wrap them in strips of flour sacks soaked in tallow just to grip the axe handle. But the walls went up, the roof went on. She put in a stone hearth, proper limestone, quarried from the hills east of the valley, hauled in a borrowed wagon 3 loads at a time. She dug a root cellar 6 feet deep, lined with flat stones she carried from the creek bed on her back. She planted a kitchen garden with seeds she had brought from Pennsylvania, beans, turnips, squash, and a row of herbs her grandmother had always grown. She lived. That first winter alone was the hardest thing Nora had ever endured. The temperature dropped to 34 below in January of 1882. The wind came off the mountains in sheets that rattled the cabin walls and drove snow through every gap she hadn't sealed. Flint slept beside the hearth, and some nights Nora slept there too, curled on the stone floor with a buffalo robe pulled over both of them, listening to the timber creak and the fire pop, and the wind howling like something alive and angry. She burned through 4 cords of wood before February. She rationed her flour and salt pork so carefully that she ate only once a day for the last 3 weeks of winter. But she survived. And when the thaw came in March, she walked out onto the porch and looked at the valley, the willows budding along the creek, the snow retreating up the mountainsides, the mud thick and black and promising, and she knew she wasn't leaving. And she rode. Every week, sometimes twice, Nora saddled Juniper and rode the length of Red Willow Creek from the northern springs to the southern flats. She told people she was checking on the water level. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. What she was really doing was reading the banks. It was something her grandfather had taught her. The habit of looking not at the water, but at what the water had done to the land around it. Where were the banks eroding? Where were they holding? What kind of stone lay beneath the soil? Where did the creek run fast and shallow? And where did it run deep and steady? These were the questions Carl Meyer would have asked, and they were the questions Nora asked now, riding slowly along the creek with Flint, trotting beside her and Juniper, picking her way through the willows. By the autumn of 1883, she had been riding that creek for 2.5 years. She knew it the way a doctor knows a patient. Not just its surface, but its history, its weaknesses, its hidden strengths. And she had noticed something that no one else had. The southern crossing, the wide, easy ford where the main road met the creek, sat on banks made entirely of clay. Soft, reddish clay that looked solid enough in summer, but turned to soup after every heavy rain. Nora had watched those banks retreat 6 inches a year, sometimes more. After the spring floods of 1882, she had measured a full 2 feet of erosion on the western bank. Wagon wheels already sank to the hubs after storms. Drivers cursed and whipped their teams. Everyone blamed the mud, but the mud was a symptom. The real problem was the ground itself. 2 miles upstream, there was a bend in the creek that nobody talked about. The water ran through a narrow channel between walls of exposed limestone, pale gray rock, solid as iron, rising 8 feet above the waterline on both sides. The banks didn't erode. They couldn't. They were stone. The water ran deeper there, but it ran steady, and the channel was straight enough that a bridge could span it in 40 feet. The approach from the east was a gentle slope of packed gravel. The approach from the west was steeper but solid, limestone shelf all the way down. The bend had a reputation for flooding in spring, and that was true. The narrow channel funneled snowmelt into a fast, deep current that could run 6 feet above normal for a week or 2 in April. But Nora had watched it carefully through 2 spring seasons, and she had seen what the skeptics hadn't. The water rose, yes. It rose fast and high, but it didn't move the stone. It didn't carve the banks. It didn't undercut anything. The flood came and the flood went, and the limestone stood exactly where it had stood before, unchanged in 10,000 years. When the auction was announced, Nora rode to the land office and purchased a narrow strip along the limestone bend, 40 acres, mostly rock and scrub juniper, useless for farming or grazing. She paid $1.10 an acre. The clerk, a young man named Emmett Hale, looked at the survey map and then looked at Nora with an expression she had learned to recognize in the years since Thomas died. It was the look men gave a woman when they believed she had made a mistake but didn't think it was their place to say so. "That's the rocky bend up past the Wheeler place," Emmett said carefully. "Steep banks, no road access. You sure about that parcel, Mrs. Prescott?" "I'm sure," Nora said. She signed the papers and rode home. Word spread the way it always did in a valley with 40 families and one general store. By the end of the week, half the county knew that the Prescott widow had spent $44 on a strip of rock that couldn't grow hay, couldn't water cattle, and couldn't be reached by any existing road. Jonas Wheeler, whose ranch sat a mile downstream from the bend, was the first to say it out loud. He was standing on the porch of Harlan's General Store on a Saturday afternoon, talking to Frank Jessup and a cattle buyer named Garrett Hollis, when Nora rode past on Juniper with Flint at her heels. "There goes the woman who bought herself a cliff," Jonas said, loud enough for Nora to hear. 40 acres of straight-up rock. I've ranched next to that bend for 12 years and I wouldn't graze a goat on it. Frank Jessup laughed. "Maybe she plans to quarry it." "She'd need a road first," Garrett Hollis said. "And men to work it, and a market to sell to. That rock isn't worth the powder to blast it." Jonas shook his head. "That's what happens when a woman tries to speculate on land. No offense to Mrs. Prescott. She's a hard worker, I'll give her that. But buying that parcel was the act of someone who doesn't understand ground." Nora heard every word. She didn't stop. She didn't turn. Flint looked up at her once, his amber eyes steady, and she reached down and scratched behind his ear without breaking stride. She understood ground better than any of them. She just hadn't told them why. Through the winter of 1883 to 84, Nora did something that confused her neighbors even further. She hired 2 men from the settlement at Pine Bluff, brothers named Ike and Solomon Darrow, who had worked railroad construction in Wyoming, and set them to clearing a path from the main valley road to the limestone bend. It wasn't a proper road, not yet. It was a trace, wide enough for a single wagon, graded just enough to keep the water from pooling. The Darrow brothers worked through December and January, cutting brush and moving rock, and Nora worked alongside them every day, her hands raw from the cold, her breath freezing in clouds around her face while Flint watched from atop a limestone outcrop like a sentinel. People on a path to a piece of rock that's worth less than the road itself. Margaret Tully, who ran the boarding house in town, was kinder, but no less certain. "Poor thing," she said to the postmaster's wife over coffee. "She's been alone too long. Grief does strange things to a mind." Even the few people who liked Nora, and there were several, particularly among the women of the valley, couldn't make sense of it. Clara Abbott, whose homestead bordered Nora's to the north, rode over one February morning to ask directly. "Nora, people are worried about you," Clara said, standing in Nora's kitchen while Flint lay by the stove. "That land you bought, there's nothing there. What are you planning?" Nora poured Clara a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "You know the Southern Crossing?" she said. "Of course." "Have you looked at the banks lately?" "Really looked?" Clara frowned. "They're muddy. They're always muddy." "They're not just muddy," Nora said. "They're disappearing. Every spring takes more. The clay is soft. The creek is eating it. 5 years from now, 10 at the outside, that crossing won't hold a bridge. It won't hold anything. Clara was quiet for a moment. And the rocky bend? Limestone, Nora said. Solid limestone, 8 feet deep on both sides. My grandfather was a stonemason. He taught me what holds and what doesn't. That bend has been there since before anyone in this valley was born, and it'll be there long after we're all gone. If they want a bridge that lasts, they'll have to build it on stone. Clara looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "You might be right, but what if the county just rebuilds at the southern crossing anyway?" "They might," Nora said, "and it'll wash out again. Clay is a liar. Water always finds the truth in it." Clara didn't entirely understand, but she didn't argue. She finished her coffee and rode home, and if she told anyone what Nora had said, it didn't change the general opinion of the valley. Spring came in March of 1884, and it came hard. The snowpack in the mountains that year was the heaviest anyone could remember. Old-timers at the general store said it hadn't been that deep since 1869. When the warming came in the third week of March, it came fast. Temperatures jumped from the 20s to the 50s in 4 days. Red Willow Creek went from its normal 6-foot width to a roaring brown torrent 30 feet across in less than a week. The old wooden bridge at the southern crossing held for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, March 27th, 1884, the western bank gave way. Not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once, a 15-foot section of clay collapsing into the flood like a wall of brown sugar dissolving in hot water. The bridge timbers twisted, cracked, and were carried downstream in a tangle of lumber and iron bolts. By noon, there was nothing left but a gap in the road and 2 ragged banks of exposed clay still calving into the current. Freight stopped, stagecoaches stopped, the cattle trail was severed. For 2 weeks, the only way across Red Willow Creek was a dangerous ford 3 miles south, where the water spread wide and shallow over a gravel bar, and even that crossing was risky with the water running high. The county sent 2 engineers from the territorial office in June after the water had dropped. Their names were Alderman and Hatch, and they spent 4 days surveying the southern crossing, taking measurements, driving test rods into the banks, and shaking their heads. Nora heard about their visit from Clara Abbott and rode down to watch from a distance, Flint beside her, saying nothing. The engineer's report, when it came, said exactly what Nora had known it would say. The clay banks at the southern crossing were unsuitable for bridge construction. The substrate was, unstable. Seasonal flooding would continue to erode the foundation. Rebuilding at the same location would be, in the engineer's words, an investment in repeated failure. They recommended finding an alternative site with natural stone foundations. The county surveyor rode the length of Red Willow Creek that July, mapping every possible crossing point. It took him 2 days. When he reached the limestone bend 2 miles upstream from the old crossing, he stopped, dismounted, walked out onto the rock shelf, and stood there for a long time, looking at the clean gray walls rising on either side of the water. He rode to Nora's cabin that evening. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands while Flint watched him from the doorway. "I believe you own the land at the limestone bend." "I do," Nora said. "The county is going to need to build there." "I know." The surveyor, his name was Arthur Keene, studied her face. "You knew," he said. It wasn't a question. "My grandfather was a stonemason," Nora said. "He taught me to read rock. That bend is the only place on this creek with natural stone foundations on both banks. I've known that since I first wrote it in 1881. Keene was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The county will want to buy the land." "The county can build on it," Nora said, "but I'm not selling." What Nora proposed instead was something no one in the valley had seen a woman negotiate before. She offered the county a long-term agreement, a 99-year lease on the bridge site itself, the 40-foot span where the crossing would stand, at a nominal annual fee of $1. In exchange, she retained full ownership of the surrounding 40 acres and exclusive rights to operate crossing services on both sides of the bridge, the county commissioners argued. Jonas Wheeler, who sat on the county board, argued loudest of all. "We shouldn't be beholden to one landowner for a public crossing," he said at the board meeting in August. "Especially not a—" He stopped himself, but everyone in the room heard the word he didn't say. Arthur Keene, who had been invited to present his survey findings, spoke quietly. "Gentlemen, there is exactly one location on Red Willow Creek with the geological stability to support a permanent bridge. Mrs. Prescott owns it. You can negotiate with her, or you can spend the next 10 years rebuilding on clay." The board approved the agreement in September. Construction began in October. Nora didn't just wait for the bridge to be built. While the county engineers and a crew of 12 men laid the stone abutments and bolted the iron trusses into the limestone walls, Nora and the Darrow brothers widened the trace road into a proper 2-wagon track. She graded the approaches on both sides of the crossing. She cleared a flat acre on the eastern bank and, through the winter of 1884 to 85, built a small but solid trading post, a log building with a stone foundation, 20 feet by 30, with a covered porch facing the road and a stable in the back that could hold 8 horses. The bridge was completed on April 14th, 1885. It was 42 feet long, 16 feet wide, built on stone abutments sunk directly into the limestone bedrock. The engineers said it would last 100 years. Looking at those pale gray walls rising solid and unchanged on either side of the water, Nora believed them. The road shifted. It had to. The old southern crossing was gone. Nothing left but a muddy gap and 2 collapsing banks that grew wider every spring. The new bridge stood on stone, and the road bent to meet it, curving north through the valley along the trace Nora had cut, passing directly by her trading post before crossing the water and continuing west toward the territorial road. Within 6 months, every stagecoach in the county used the new crossing. Freight wagons stopped at Nora's trading post for water, supplies, and fresh horses. Cattle drives that had once funneled through the southern flats now followed the new road north to the limestone bend. Nora hired a young couple from town, the Iversons, a quiet pair who had come west from Illinois and knew how to work without being told, to help run the post. And by the second year, she had added a blacksmith shed, a small corral with room for 12 horses, and a watering trough fed by a spring she had found in the limestone 50 yards upstream. She ran the operation the way she ran everything else, carefully, methodically, with attention to details that other people overlooked. The prices at the trading post were fair, the water was clean, the stable was dry. She kept a ledger in a leather-bound book that Thomas had given her for their first anniversary, and every transaction went into it in her small, precise handwriting. Drovers and freight men learned quickly that Prescott's Crossing was a place where a man could get an honest deal, and they told other drovers and freight men, and the traffic grew. By the summer of 1886, the trading post was clearing more money in a month than Nora's homestead had earned in its best year. She didn't spend it on herself. She invested it back. A new roof for the stable, a covered loading dock behind the post, a small bunkhouse where drivers could sleep out of the weather for 25 cents a night. Every improvement drew more traffic, and every increase in traffic justified the next improvement. It was the same principle her grandfather had understood about stonework. Build on solid ground and each layer supports the next. The place people had called an inconvenient bend became the busiest point in the valley. Prescott's Crossing, they called it, and the name stuck. Jonas Wheeler came to the trading post one afternoon in the autumn of 1886. He tied his horse and stood on the porch for a long time, watching the wagons roll across the bridge before he went inside. Nora was behind the counter, sorting freight receipts. Flint lay at her feet, gray-muzzled now but still watchful, his amber eyes following Jonas as he crossed the room. "Mrs. Prescott," Jonas said. He took off his hat. "I owe you an apology." Nora looked up from her papers. "I said you didn't understand ground," Jonas continued. "I said it to your face and behind your back, and I was wrong. You understood it better than any of us. I'm sorry." Nora studied him for a moment. There was no satisfaction in his embarrassment, no sweetness in his shame. She had never wanted to humiliate anyone. She had only wanted to be right and to build something that would last. "Apology accepted, Mr. Wheeler," she said. "Would you like some coffee?" He would. They sat on the porch and drank it, watching a freight wagon cross the bridge, its wheels rumbling on the iron deck, the limestone walls standing steady beneath it. "How did you know?" Jonas asked. "My grandfather taught me," Nora said. "He was a stonemason in Bavaria. He said clay was a liar. It looks solid until the water finds it. Stone tells the truth. You just have to know how to listen." Jonas shook his head slowly. "I've been ranching this valley since '71. Never once looked at those banks that way." "Most people look at the road," Nora said. "I looked at what was under it." Flint shifted at her feet and rested his chin on her boot. Juniper stood in the corral behind the post, her coat catching the last of the autumn sun. Somewhere across the bridge, a stagecoach horn sounded. 15 years later, in the spring of 1900, a young woman named Ada Prescott, the daughter of Thomas's brother, who had come west at 18 to learn the business, sat on the same porch and watched the morning traffic. Prescott's Crossing had grown. There was a hotel now, small but clean, and a livery stable, and a general store that competed with Harlan's for the valley trade. The bridge had been widened in 1894 to accommodate the heavier freight wagons that came with the railroad spur at Pine Bluff. The limestone abutments hadn't moved. The stone was unchanged. Nora was 53 years old that spring. Her hair had gone silver at the temples, and her hands bore the calluses of 30 years of frontier work. But she still rode Juniper's granddaughter, a bay mare she called Sage, along the creek every week, checking the banks, reading the rock, watching the water. She moved slower than she once had, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, and she still noticed things that other people missed. A hairline crack in a foundation stone, a shift in the creek's current after a storm, the way certain willows leaned that told you where the water table sat 6 feet below the surface. Flint had died in the winter of 1892, sleeping by the stove in the trading post on a night when the temperature dropped to 20 below. Nora had buried him on the limestone bluff above the bridge, where he could watch the crossing forever. She had carried the stones for his grave herself, fitting them together the way her grandfather had taught her, tight and solid, a cairn that would outlast the century. A young dog named Slate, gray-coated, amber-eyed, with the same quiet watchfulness, had shown up at the post the following spring. thin and limping from a torn pad on his right front paw, and Nora had fed him without surprise. Some things she had learned simply continued. Ada often asked Nora to tell the story of how she had bought the land. Nora told it simply, without embellishment, the way she told everything. She never made herself the hero of it. She never said the men of the valley had been fools. She said only that she had looked at the ground and understood what it was telling her, and that her grandfather had given her the eyes to see it. Most people look at what's easy, Nora told Ada once, sitting on the porch in the long June twilight, while Slate dozed at their feet. They look at the wide crossing, the smooth banks, the road that's already there. They don't ask what's underneath. They don't ask what happens when the water comes. And you always ask, Ada said. I always ask, Nora agreed, because the water always comes. 3 other crossings in the territory had been rebuilt on stone foundations by then, each one surveyed with the principles Nora had explained to Arthur Keene, who had become the territorial chief engineer. Keene credited her openly, telling anyone who would listen that a widow with a stonemason's education had understood in 1883 what his engineering school hadn't taught him until he saw it with his own eyes. She didn't read a single engineering manual, Keene said at a territorial conference in 1898. She read the creek, and she read it better than any of us. On a morning in late May of 1900, Nora rode Sage down to the bridge and stopped at the center of the span. She dismounted and stood with her hands on the iron railing, looking down at the water running clear and steady between the limestone walls. Slate sat beside her, his amber eyes catching the light. The creek was high with snowmelt. It always was in May, but the stone held firm, as it always had, as it always would. A freight wagon approached from the west, and the driver tipped his hat as he passed. He was young, maybe 25, and he probably didn't know who she was. He only knew that the bridge was solid and the road was good, and there was a trading post on the other side where a man could water his horses and buy a meal. That was enough. That was the whole point. Nora Prescott had never wanted to be famous. She had wanted to be right. She had wanted to build something on ground that would hold. And every wagon that crossed that bridge, every stagecoach, every cattle drive, every family heading west with everything they owned piled in a single wagon, crossed on stone that she had recognized when no one else had looked closely enough to see it. She scratched Slate behind the ear. She mounted Sage. She rode home along the creek, the water running steady beside her, the limestone walls standing pale and solid in the morning sun, unchanged and unchanging, the way good ground always is when you know what to look for.